lots and lots of people who are in transit. They are moving between one state of being and another. And deconstruction is a really apt word, I think. Theological, personal deconstruction. Sometimes it's born out of coming to terms with trauma, but more often I think it's like this philosophical, theological, spiritual shift that they're going through. And it's just like, I have now left behind what can no longer be believed, what I will not believe. And it is a lonely place, right? When you're in between and you've not found the new, and you feel like you're the only person who's ever been there in the history of the world. Surely no one but. The we is great big right now. So the question for me would be the able liminal guides who are not afraid to go into those spaces with people.
Well, welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast. My name is Dr. Tom Rundell, your curator of conversations. And today we have Dr. Timothy Carson. And Dr. Timothy Carson is a academic mind, but with a very practical expression. He has done lots of work on the area of liminality, and I might say is the voice today on liminality, pulling in and all of these different spheres of disciplines, mental health, pastoral realms, politics, religion, all of these places, how liminality touches all of these places. He has made this hub called the Liminality Project. He has a publishing house called the Liminality Press. He leads the Guild for Engaged Liminality, where all of these folks of different disciplines come and talk about different liminal places and how they express themselves in our world today. And Dr. Timothy actually was a TEDx speaker on the area of liminality. So his TED Talk is online and is wonderful, and y'all should go there. Today we talk about the neurology of liminal places and what happens to the brain when we walk through them, and kind of the sociology of liminality and what happens when we go through liminal spaces, not just me and my deconstruction, but the we, the greater we. And we get into lots of different fields of study, and we talk a little nerdy stuff, but we also keep it down into the practical realms as well. So I hope that you enjoy this conversation with Dr. Timothy Carson. Well, how do you want to be addressed? I got Dr. Tim Carson here because, you know,
that's fine.
You're legit, Tim, and then we can switch over to Tim and Tom after that.
Yes, over to Tim and Tom. Yes.
Tim and Tom, the Tim and Tom show.
Yes.
Well, Dr. Tim Carson, welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast. This has been a conversation in the making for a little bit too long because we've had to reschedule it, I think 4 times because of snow and holidays and doctor things and all these other things. So we're finally here. We're finally talking. I'm excited to have you on the show today.
Such a pleasure to join with you. Yeah, we have had some unforeseen interruptions, but here we are.
Yeah, I mean, we had a pretty epic blizzard here in Michigan that I haven't seen snow like this in 10 years. It dumped a good 2 feet of snow on us in probably less than a week, and things were just nuts. My son's school was closed for snow, ice, and fog all in the same week.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah. So that was crazy, but here we are.
Yes.
Now, you are the curator of the Liminality Project, and that's like this hub of resources exploring liminal spaces. Now, how did you encounter the concept of liminality, and what was it about that captured your imagination?
Yeah, it was quite an adventure. Earlier in my life, I was working on a doctoral program, and it was at that kind of stage where you have a direction in your mind and you have kind of disparate pieces that you somehow know belong together, but you have not found the hook. You haven't found that kind of central hub. And so one day I was in the library. I remember the exact moment. I was down in the stacks and I was doing research, and I was reading a particular book. It happened to be on Practical Theology. It was Don Browning. And I was reading this text, and Browning just mentioned liminality. He just kind of tossed it off in the middle of a sentence, and there was a footnote. And it's like, well, what's this? And so I went to the bottom of the page, and there was this footnote on liminality. And he gave a very basic kind of definition about what liminality is. And I read that, and Atlantis rose out of the sea. There was this moment of clarity, and I said, aha, there it is. That's the thing I've been looking for. It is this interim state of being between things, transitional states, and that sense of great discovery that takes place only in those kind of places. And that was the beginning of it all. And I think it's appropriate that this discovery took place in a footnote at the bottom of a page, right? In the margins.
In the margins.
It's metaphorical as well.
Yeah.
And so that emerged, and I was off and running. And then I created a whole dissertation that revolved around this in many dimensions. And eventually that was published into the dissertation with modifications, was published into a book. And that ended up on university bookshelves everywhere. I'm surprised how many people were referencing this, because at the time, that was, ancient history, 1996. It was fairly new in many quarters. It was new, like it's new today. And then it was picked up by another publisher in England, and they printed and published a second edition. And that's out there now. So one thing led to another, and I eventually created this whole website platform, the Liminality Project. And it is kind of a comprehensive one-stop shopping location where you can go to find out about liminality. There's regular blog posts, there's resources there, contact info. And I was really surprised. I guess I shouldn't have been, but that site receives 500 unique visits a month.
Oh, wow.
It's and from all over the world, mostly English-speaking world, but all kinds of other places as people are researching this. And as a result of that, I receive all these interesting contacts from around the world. A lot of times from graduate students who are doing work in some field and they're relating liminality, and they've done their research and they find me, and then they contact me and say, hey, can we have a conversation? Like I just had that conversation with a guy working on his graduate thesis in sociology in Poland. And so we Zoomed together and had this conversation. I just had a conversation this last semester with a grad student in the UK who's working on a film degree, and he was doing a documentary on liminality and aesthetics. And so he contacts me and he interviews me, and then I happen to be teaching a class at the university on liminality, and I say, hey, how would you like to connect our class with your documentary? He goes, cool. And so we Zoom him into class and we have conversations with him. He Zooms with each individual member of the class and interviews them and saves all the audio. And those pieces of audio dialogue end up floating into his documentary. So it has just kind of opened up this international door with people who are exploring the same things. And then later along the way with other interested people, we formed the Guild for Engaged Liminality. And that's basically just a network of people who work in liminality and who are interested in it from all kinds of fields, literature and sociology and spirituality and organizational leadership. And we come together, it's a kind of informal format. We come together in Zoom twice a year, and somebody presents on some facet of liminality, and the rest of us engage with that. So in the spring, for example, we have a person from England who is really going big time into the digital world and aesthetics of liminality, and she will present to us, and we'll engage around that. So it has been a fun adventure.
Now, it's funny how you ran into the liminality subject is the same way I did. I was in my doctoral classes, and Leonard Sweet was the professor of one of my classes, and he had mentioned the word liminal in a sentence and then just moved on, but the word just struck me, and I thought, wait, that's the thing. But he never defined it. We didn't even talk about it. I don't even remember the sentence it was said in, but it just hit me like the footnote. And I'm like, I just stopped listening in class at that point, and I was Googling, what is liminality? Why is it hitting me like a ton of bricks right now? And then I changed my entire dissertation to be from, I was going to do something about John, eternal life and something. And I was like, nope, it is now liminality. I don't know what I'm going to talk about, but here we go. And I dove in.
Right. And, I've had the honor and the pleasure of collaborating with a number of authors who have joined me in 2 anthologies that I've edited. And some of those people were like nominally familiar with liminality before they began, and yet they wrote a chapter in which they forced themselves to integrate whatever it is they were working with liminality. And now I've noticed later that they have gone kind of full bore into that area, maturing it. Like I'm thinking of Barbara Brown Taylor. Mm-hmm. She wrote the foreword to Neither Here Nor There, which is one of the anthologies. And that is kind of her thing now. Her latest book is something like Treasures of the Darkness. It's all about interim states and twilight experiences. And she wrote that eloquent kind of introduction to this anthology. And it's fun to kind of follow these people and see who they're working with and where they go with it, how it changes. Padre Gotuma wrote a chapter for Neither Here Nor There, a very poetic approach because he's such a poet. And I got a contact from him within the last, 4 or 5 months. And he said, hey, that chapter I wrote in the anthology, could you send me copies of that? I want to weave that into something. So that's how our lives are. In its most adventuresome form, I think that's how our lives can be. Just networked with multitudes of dear souls who are doing great work in disparate ways. And it's such a pleasurable blessing to run into them.
Yeah.
And have conversations like we're having right now.
Yeah. Now, you have years of experience as like a parish pastor. And one of the facets of liminality that you've explored is some of the spiritual roots. What faith roots do you have as a person? Like what kind of soil has your life grown out of, and how did faith play a part in that?
Yeah. Well, I came out of liberal Protestantism, and that afforded me all kinds of explorations into intersections with theology and psychology and theology and anthropology and theology and great symbolisms and myths of the world. And all of that goes hand in hand with this. So as a parish pastor, though, the most formative things have to do with, I'd say 2 kind of arenas. One is in your community, that lives and breathes according to narratives, rites, and rituals, you're constantly engaged in rites of transformation, whether they're seasonal prescribed rites, or they're rites of crisis, or developmental rites of becoming, like confirmations. And so it's really one after another. You are a ritual leader. And if you think about the passages your community is making, perhaps it's a repetitious passage, like a season of the year, but oftentimes a passage of urgency, and you happen to be a liminal guide within that, you're engaged in it constantly. So I really cut my teeth on this in a kind of a workshop of the spirit. I mean, it was very earthy. It was very, in the weeds. It was in actual communities and actual lives. I mean, that's why it means so much to me, I think, on that level. So that would be one facet. That's why it's so, immediate. And then there is the spin-off of that, which is writing, publishing, and people responding to that, and workshopping, and that dimension of it, which is a whole different audience. And it's gratifying in its own kind of way, because what you reflect on and what you write about and the conversations you're in are on a different level, because your audience is different. It's more diverse by far than your local community. And so you start to broaden your definitions and your applications, kind of like Victor Turner, broadened his understanding, as he moved from, say, von Gennep's kind of very anthropological approach to pre-industrial societies and cultures that use rites of passage to traverse all these changes. Victor Turner moves mid-20th century into applying this almost to everything in modern culture. I mean, even things like, coming to the conclusion that the kind of modern equivalencies of rites of passage could include therapeutic encounters, seeing therapy as the canister in which the liminal guide and rites of transformation take place. So you start to apply this to much broader categories. And I would say the end of the trajectory for me now has been to, though I am connected to communities of the spirit right now and participate in that, I'm teaching in a public university. And so I'm teaching in the honors college and the religion department of a public university, and teach liminal studies. And so my audience is really broad now.
Yeah.
It's very diverse, multi-religious, people with no religious affiliation, people who used to have it, students of all kinds, all disciplines, all exposures, and departments that come together. And so my courses are very diverse. So I teach liminality in literature, liminality in the sciences. Last semester, I had a seminar, liminality in time. Right now, I'm teaching a course, liminality and literature of the fantastical. I've taught a course, liminality in film, which is, wow, that's really relevant. So you start to broaden that, and I find that very adventuresome for a person who started in theology to broaden to that larger world.
You're talking about broadening these things, and you just kind of broadened something. I grew up in the evangelical tradition. You got liberal Protestant tradition. I have transitioned into more of a mainline Protestant tradition in congregationalism, but you painted this picture of the pastor as someone who leads people through rites of passages, through liminal spaces. And, my evangelical training as a pastor was more of, you're discipling people with the right knowledge so that they can be cogs in the church machine that keep things building and growing and moving and expanding. And, they modernize that with the church planting movement, but it's all the same language. It's all the same thing, is we're filling people's minds with the right information about God and then setting them loose to build this thing that we call the church. And you have this shift, like pastors have roles in neighborhoods and communities to lead people through rites of passage. And that is, those are liminal places that, Turner and Van Gepp were talking about. The rites of passage is liminal spaces, and those transform our mind. And I think that is, it's like what the evangelicals wish discipleship was and would accomplish is accomplished through, walking people through these liminal rites of passages. And one of my roles in this neighborhood is I work with the funeral homes, and I do a lot of funerals for community members and church members. And I'm just the go-to call him guy because he'll lead them through this rite of passage called death. And I think of baptism, membership of a church community. All of these things are not ways to get information in our brains to make us better function as cogs in the church machine, but these are ways that develop us as humans by leading us through rites of passage. And you recently spoke at TEDx about the subject of liminality, and you said that our brain is wired for these transits through liminal space. And what is going on neurologically that changes us when we walk through these liminal spaces? And I guess my angle is, as a pastor, and many people listen to this show are going to be from a faith roots place of questioning and wondering, what is the role of Christianity in this world and faith in this world, and what they knew doesn't work anymore. But what is going on neurologically when we lead people through these rites of passages in these liminal spaces? What changes?
Right. I guess it shouldn't surprise us that the evolution of the human species and our brains and everything, it includes all of us, includes our biological selves, our neurological selves, our social selves, our ritual selves, our traditions. They're all together. And so the brain researchers that have done work on the parallels between what happens in the brain and what happens during rites and rituals, come up with, fantastic kind of conclusions, which is there's a functionality about the brain that is fitted to and designed to making these kind of passages. And so even such things as ritual trances, the kind of way the brain functions in the midst of ritual, even with drumming and things like that we are kind of fitted to do these very things. And so part of it's adaptation of the brain. And part of it is we are designed to be, that's why we survived, that to be creatures that actually know how to get through things, how to actually transition. Like Tufts University in 2000 had this research in which they brought in human subjects into their laboratory, and they designed these scenarios in which they would create a familiar room and environment, and then so the subjects knew what the familiar room was, and then they introduced an unfamiliar room, or a room that had been modified, that had just maybe two facets that were the same as the previous one. And immediately, the brain takes the individual into this information gathering and starts seeking alternatives, because the neural pathways that perhaps were well established to understand the former situation are not going to help. I mean, we have these shortcuts all the time to help us function because we can't compute every novel thing in the universe every time one comes down the way. But once a shortcut doesn't work or it's blocked, the brain is ingenious in the way that it goes around it, starts finding new pathways. And I mentioned this in my TEDx talk. I have one of my students at the university works in the brain research laboratory. And they had a kind of similar research, but different. They, hooked the person up to all the EEGs and all the brain, they measured all the brainwave activity and all that kind of thing. And then they would introduce some novel, new, unfamiliar information or data. And the brain glitches out. This is their highly technical language, right? Glitches out. It just, in this nanosecond, it just comes to a full stop. It pauses. And it pauses because it's got to reset itself. And when it does, then it goes around the neural pathways and it accesses old ways of knowing and tries to integrate it with new ways of knowing and tries to harmonize memory with what's the new information, all in the interest of finding some new way forward. It's just spectacular, when they look at that. And so I think it is quite fair to say that we have come to be wired to do that kind of thing. And the liminal moment, you might think of like interior and exterior parallels. The liminal moment is, say, that moment when the brain glitches out, there's this pause on the inside. On the outside, it might be a threshold that we've just crossed. It might be a surprising one. It might be one by design. It might be rites and rituals. It might be a crisis. But there is a pause and a reset, a recalibration in which we move differently. And, we in faith communities would talk about transformation at those moments. You have an occurrence, an event that takes place, and it affects either an individual or a family or a whole country, and there's a pandemic or there's some kind of social crisis, and we're cast into the wilderness, and we have to find a way out of the wilderness, and it's confusing and chaotic, and the old rules aren't working anymore, and we have to find a new language, and we have to find new symbols, and the kind of hidden treasure is there and available in those liminal times and spaces, especially if we have a liminal guide who knows the territory, knows something about process, who knows something about has not shared in every liminal moment that we have, that's impossible, but knows how it works and can come alongside as this liminal guide and companion. That person becomes an essential passage person and is exceptionally important, not in just as, say, an individual counselor or a chaplain. That's true, but not only that, but as the leader of communities. I think that true leaders of the future will be exceptionally good liminal guides. I mean, we live in this time of great rapidity of change and huge complexity, and we're making shifts left and right. So who is the person, or who are the persons who can help usher us from one thing to another? Well, it's people who know something about liminality. It's people who know something about transitions. They are your trusted leaders. They are the guides who are going to take you from one place to another. Wonderful researcher and writer about liminality, Gisela Wendling, and she has a wonderful book on the liminal pathways. And she has just started an intriguing research. I've been very honored to be a part of a working group that's starting to explore this. It is like a facet of her research. She's a sociologist, and so she hasn't nailed that down in research terms, and she's working on that. And it has to do, these are her words, in forming liminal competency. And the gist of the idea is we talk about resilience today, forming resilience. That's really important. I think it's important. So what is the missing link in resilience? Well, she would say it is liminal competency. If we're going to form resilient people who know how to usher people into resilience and are resilient themselves, resilient leaders, they have to be competent. They have to have a skill set about liminality to draw from, a toolkit. And so that's what her research is right now. It's what's in that toolkit? What does one need to know to be an exceptionally good liminal guide? And obviously, in the history of the world, people have come up with what they think those things are without using the word liminality. I mean, what makes for a great spiritual director? What makes for a great therapist? What makes for a great pastor of a community? What makes for that? Well, we've identified some things there, and they're generally not, like you talked about earlier, Tom, building the structure of the church to, be a more efficient institution. They're generally not that. They're generally people who give themselves to transformation. It's those people. Their eye is on transformation, and they look through this liminal lens, and they understand how it's unfolding, and they become helpful.
Now, I think when you describe what's happening in the brain with liminality, like my pastoral brain kicked in and said, he's describing repentance, not the repentance of the fundamentalists beating the pulpit saying, stop behaving these ways, but the actual word repentance, which means get above your mind, metanoia, above your mind. And you have to think differently about your life in order to get in order to have new things happen in your life or new behaviors come out of your life. You have to think differently about your life. And so the call for repentance isn't a call to, stop sinning, you're a loser, but more of get above the mind that you currently have so that you have a better vantage point to see, the landscape and then act accordingly. It's like, and that you described, and John was out in the desert when he's asking for these things, out in the liminal places of, the desert landscapes. And so you're describing in my brain, my pastoral brain is going to, wow, that's like repentance, but in its...
Oh, I think so. That is a great definition of metanoia, which is, making a shift, a turn, a dramatic shift. And it's a shift or turn in our consciousness.
Yeah.
We have now been ushered into a new way to see the world or to see ourselves that we did not have before. Therefore, we're going to go a new direction. We're going to emphasize different things. We're going to make different choices. We're going to have a different vocation. We're going to do all these things. And if liminality is a phenomenon that is both an interior one and an exterior one, when we're passing through these exterior domains, we are making equally important interior passages. We are changing on the inside. I mean, it is an actual shift that takes place in consciousness. It's as real as anything that we might know. And so, language about becoming the new being is actual and real. One becomes a new being. And I am a newer being than I was 10 years, 15 years ago, 25, 30, 40 years ago. There are remnants of me that have strings of continuity that have come down, but also the newness has replaced a lot of what was. And through an unending process of metanoia and transformation. And it's in our brain, it's in our values, it's in our practices, it's comprehensive, it's holistic.
it's like it's in our cells too, because our cells are dying and new cells are replacing. And it's like that one Greek question philosophy that says, if a ship sets sail on one shore and then you replace every part of the ship on journey and then it arrives, is it the same ship? Now, you write about
Right.
voluntary liminal spaces like monasticism or Amish communities, because liminal spaces are usually characterized in deserts, wildernesses, landscapes where there's not maps and roads. And it's a form of, to use the academic term, anti-structure, because there's the building of the structure, the temple, the church, the institution, the country, whatever. But then there's people who go off in liminal spaces to relearn how to be human, to come back to structure, to speak in it. But how can we promote the liminal transitions of anti-structure without devolving into anti-science or conspiracy theorists or flat earth weirdness that they're like, well, I'm not a part of the establishment. I don't think those thoughts. I'm over here in this. How do you, I don't even know how to describe the question I'm asking, but can you see like how that can become really weird and dangerous fast?
Yeah, it can be. If we define structure as all the norms of society, including all the kind of knowledges of society, it might be easy to kind of like fall off that edge and go kind of, conspiracy theory central, that kind of thing. That's probably not the meaning of, say, anti-structure, especially in Turner's terms. It is, and when I describe this to my students, I speak in terms of not rites of passage in these terms, but marginality. So some people are born into marginality by what they have inherited, where they have been, the social location that they inhabit. But other people choose to live in the margins by design. It is voluntary. And so whether you're talking about a utopian community where one has left kind of the structure of the world to form a new community on the edge, or if it's something like an Amish religious kind of community where one is forming an identity that is over and against kind of dominant culture, then that becomes something that can be transformative. It is almost always related to identity, and it is also almost always related to some kind of move away from the norms that have been quite unfulfilling in the center. So you think of the Desert Fathers and Mothers in the 4th century that, swam, as some have said, swam away from dominant culture like rats swimming away from a ship, including the church in those terms. So Abba Anthony and the others that went out to the Egyptian desert, were finding a new intensity that had been lost in the center. Because structure, as von Gennep would say, eventually the juice drains out of everything. The juice, the intensity, the air is let out of the balloon. Eventually, that would include the church, that would include a society, that eventually ends up serving its own structures, but has lost its sense of passion or its reason for being in the first place. Then that has to be rediscovered. And often it's rediscovered by going to the edge, going to the margins. That's why I think people make pilgrimages. That's why I make pilgrimages. That's why we go on retreat. That's why we want to find the workings of the Spirit outside of what has become predictable and maybe our routine that has become, in some cases, life-crushing. So we try to find that at the edges. So in those respects, I think, and that's why people, go to holy people who live at the margins. They make pilgrimages, they seek their counsel. It's because they believe that there is perhaps a wisdom to be found there that's been lost at the center.
You wrote some things citing Turner's work, and you say, I think that liminality is not just an idea or a concept, but it seems to be a reality that we all occupy now, especially since we've walked through this group liminal season called the pandemic. And, it's funny that we have these stories in our scriptures of the Exodus, of the people leaving Egypt and going out into the desert, the liminal spaces, and that's where they meet God. And we really glorify those stories about, oh, wow, they're following God and everything's glorious. But then everyone's complaining. And I remember growing up thinking, how can they complain? I mean, God's right there. There's miracles everywhere. And, they're in this liminal space with God and complaining about it the entire way. And it's like, then we go through the pandemic and I'm like, oh, now it makes sense. It's like, here we are in this liminal space and we want to go back to what we used to be in, and we want to change things and it's just, I find that really interesting. But you wrote something about this structure, anti-structure thing. And you talk about the liminal person. And life in communities to be understood as this process between moving between structure and anti-structure, and individuals transitioning between those two poles. And then you go on to say the attributes of the liminal person stand in binary opposition to the established structure. The liminal person takes up symbolic and transitional status that includes a kind of stripping away of the self, gender, neutrality, anonymity, submission to the process itself. Now, is a lot of the upheaval in modern day society tied to the liminal transition that we are in? And if so, how do we traverse it in a way that leads to positive outcomes and not the self-destructive things that we seem to be experiencing right now?
Right. And that portion that you quoted was not original to me. I mean, I wrote it, but it was based on Turner's understanding of the liminal person.
Yeah.
And there is this strong sense in which when we go through those processes, we are stripped down to a more essential self. We jettison, we shed our snake skin as a part of that transformation. So, and the liminal person becomes fascinating on the one hand and dangerous on the other. We are established communities are threatened by liminal characters because they represent a kind of instability. But they're seen as revelatory at the same thing. Jesus on the edge of communities was always seen as threatening and attractive at the same time. So this definition of the liminal person is really important in liminal communities. And it can be something that is destructive. And what I mean by that is that liminality is not pleasant. I'm glad you mentioned that. We find people are in liminal situations. It isn't enjoyable all the time. In fact, it's scary as can be sometimes, many times. And to become a liminal person or be in a liminal situation doesn't guarantee an outcome. I mean, we can't kind of glamorize this. I consider it neutral. It can go either way.
Okay. Yeah.
It can, for example, like Rebecca Solnit has that wonderful book, A Paradise Built in Hell. And she talks about how this can go either way. A liminal thing, something like a pandemic or a natural disaster, can destabilize things in such a way that tyrants are displaced, or those who are the most trusted people in the community are elevated to positions of leadership. I mean, it can be both. It can happen at the same time. So I think we have to recognize that liminality doesn't guarantee everything, that human agency and or the work of the Spirit is integral to what's going to happen as a result. And therefore, communities that enter into it need to be shepherded, helped, assisted through that kind of process. Let me share a story with you. that I think gets to how this works. So I was on a Zoom today with Ukrainians. And the reason is I work with a network of Americans who help train Ukrainians in mental health services. They're becoming counselors, or they are counselors, and they're getting credentialed and that kind of thing. And so I volunteer with this. I work with them, and so I was on this Zoom today, and they're in the middle of war. And this one woman told a story about how one of her best friends' husbands was just killed in battle, and she just attended the funeral, and they were carrying his casket to the grave. All his comrades were. She has 2 small children. So this is like dangerous, painful, mournful, awful. And yet, as a part of our conversation, I shared the kind of arc of liminality, the liminal loop, and how these things take place. And these Ukrainians are sitting there, and they are such dear people, and they're listening to this. And I feel a bit like one with the greatest case of imposter syndrome ever, talking to them about something that their experience is as profound as that right now. And at the end of the conversation, I asked them, I said, well, what sense does this make to you, if any? And the woman who had gone to the funeral stopped and she said, of course, to the translator, the interpreter that we have, she said, we're all passing through something so terrible, she said, and we can't understand where we are. This understanding of liminality gives us a kind of overall schema, a kind of universal map that we human beings pass through. And to know that that's where we are, and that there are such things as thresholds, and there is such a thing as liminal chaos, and there are such things as becoming new and transforming, is very hopeful. Her words, very hopeful. I would never suggest those words to her in that situation, but she said that. And so I think it is of supreme importance that we equip people with ways to understand where they are and how they can move forward, even and especially in the midst of suffering. That's where we discover it so often. And that's what's needed the most at moments like that.
I have a similar experience with leading families through the grief process. And what I hear a lot of families say, after I get done walking them through that whole eulogy, and I celebrate the person, we share stories of who they were and what really characterized them, and we celebrate their life, but then we talk about grief. And we talk about what it is, and we talk about what it's going to do to you, and then we talk about how to traverse the grief. And I remember this last funeral I did, someone came up to me and they said, I have been to so many funerals, and nobody has said more helpful words than what you said today. And it's because I'm treating grief, this funeral, as a rite of passage, but also as a liminal space. Grief is a liminal space. I'm not the person I was. I've lost the person that held my world together. And it's a human thing, because I've done this for people who were atheists and people who are devout evangelical fundamentalist Christians. And it's just, I get those responses all the time that is so helpful. It's almost like I just lay out a map. Like here you are on the start of the grief journey, and here's what it's going to look like. Here's what it's going to do to you. Here's how to traverse. And here's going to be the road bumps, where you're going to want to try and just close yourself off from the world or not face the pain, or, I walk them through it. And it's so often never really thought of funerals as liminal rites of passage, but it really is. I'm helping people in that liminal space and providing hope for people who are in the midst of something. I don't say very religious things. I don't tell them, God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life. Or I just talk about grief. And sometimes I pray prayers if their family's okay with that, and sometimes I don't. But across the board, everyone says that is the most helpful thing anyone's ever said at a funeral before. And that your story kind of reminded me of that.
Yeah, it is maybe one of the most loving things we can do.
Yeah.
To help people see and understand that. And it's such a relief for people. Relief is a key word. It never fails. Every semester, I have these undergraduate students come in and these liminality seminars, and there's always 2 or 3 who just kind of like the light bulb goes on and they go, oh, that's what I've been in. And there's this palpable relief that just kind of pours over them as they, oh, okay, I'm not crazy. I've not gone mad. No, you've not gone mad. You're passing through this liminal stage. And it's quite normal. It can be quite awful, but you're not going mad. And there is great relief,
It seems like there's a rise in people experiencing the liminal spaces of faith these days with, we hear the word deconstruction quite a bit. There's post-evangelicalism, there's ex-evangelicalism, there's new evangelicalism. There's a lot of talk about the deconstruction process of faith. And it seems like it's just on the rise. Lots of people are identifying as none. I don't have a religious affiliation, but I do believe in a higher power or the divine or the universe, or they're keeping some form of what was, but then they're transitioning. They're not sure what they're transitioning into, and it's a very non-hospitable place to be.
Right.
There's the I am going through liminal space, but then there's the we are going through liminal space. And it seems like the deconstruction thing is a we moment and an I moment. Is there a connection between the two?
I agree. I think we're in precisely one of those moments. And I experienced the same thing you're describing with lots and lots of people who are in transit. They are moving between one state of being and another. And deconstruction is a really apt word, I think. Theological, personal deconstruction. Sometimes it's born out of coming to terms with trauma, but more often I think it's like this philosophical, theological, spiritual shift that they're going through. And it's just like, I have now left behind what can no longer be believed, what I will not believe. And it is a lonely place, right? When you're in between and you've not found the new, and you feel like you're the only person who's ever been there in the history of the world. Surely no one is, but the we is great big right now. The transitional space. So the question for me would be, who are the able souls, the able liminal guides who are not afraid to go into those spaces with people? Walk side by side with them, recognize where they are. Who are the ones who are theologically fluent enough to walk through those different languages, those different lands, and be helpful? A non-judgmental presence who's willing to reflect with them. I mean, that's gold. That is golden, right? To have that. And when people find it, they're thankful, regardless of where they're at,
How would one find that?
Yeah, that is the question, because those people are not necessarily out there in droves. If the exceptionally sensitive clergy person who's not just feathering their institutional nest can be a wonderful guide for that. They may be rare because of the pressure to do what we've been talking about, which is to be an institutional representative. They need to find people who are free enough, positioned vis-a-vis structure and anti-structure, so that they can do that kind of work. You know, I think of a Richard Rohr, you know, who's on the edge of true communities of practice, and yet in this big margin of freedom, and who is willing to entertain all comers, entertain all questions, and does not divorce those questions from larger communities and what could become. I mean, he's just one example, you know, but there are others. But I think people like that offer great hope to people. And perhaps we, you know, that's the voice that needs to be articulated the most. Imagine if that became the dominant voice and not, say, a rabid fundamentalism that shuts down all conversation immediately. Imagine, you know, how people might feel if they heard voices like that.
The person standing between structure and anti-structure as like a hospitable bridge between the two. And
nice image, a hospitable bridge.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think I've saved the most important question for last, and we need to wrap up so you can get to class. But I've been stalking you on Facebook for a while now, and I noticed that you have this tin whistle, like an Irish tin whistle, that you play in a Celtic group for a historical society. So what ignited that passion in somebody who's so like mind-blowingly articulate in liminality, and you're a tin whistle player? How'd this come about?
Well, that's, you know, it's my musical soul. And I find some of my greatest peace and thrill in making music with friends. It's been a lifelong thing. And I picked up the tin whistle in a real casual way, maybe 20 years ago. But it's really been in the last 10 years or so that I have been playing with some Irish session groups in earnest. And so that has really refined my tin whistle chops. And then in the last couple of years, I've formed a Celtic duo with a harpist. And I play tin whistle and she plays harp, and we're kind of out and around playing. We play traditional music of the British Isles, and we arrange music based on those traditional tunes. And for example, where I live, in Columbia, Missouri, there is a huge documentary film festival here called The True False. And there are at least 40 musical groups that come in and are woven into this festival. And so I will be joining with my harpist partner, and we'll be playing at that festival. Now, that is just sheer joy to me. That is pure pleasure, pure joy. I love making music. And, you know, when in doubt, sit down and make some music.
I love that.
And all else is lost.
Well, that is pretty cool. I feel like I've learned a whole lot on this episode, and I'm going to be going back to listen a few times so I can remember things that were said. So just thank you so much for coming on the show. How can people connect to you and all the work that you're doing? Where do you want to send them?
Well, they could go to the website, which is theliminalityproject.org. That's a really easy way to get to me. All my contact information is there, and they can kind of dip their toe in the liminal pond while they go there. And if they're interested, they could go take a look at the new publishing house we formed that is devoted to publishing liminal titles, and that is called the Liminality Press. And the URL is liminalitypress.com. We just came out with our first book, hot off the press, and it is called Leaning into the Liminal, a guide for counselors and companions.
Oh, that is
it can be found at any Any bookstore, anywhere.
Awesome.
Ordered online.
We'll send some links down in the show notes and everything. Well, Dr. Tim, thank you so much for coming on the Liminal Living podcast to talk about liminality. It's great to have one of the primary sources today talking about liminality here to educate us. It's just been so helpful. Thank you so much.
It has been my pleasure. And you take care, Tom. No more snow.
No more snow. We're done now. We'll see.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for listening to the Liminal Living podcast, and I hope that you really enjoyed this episode as much as I did. I know that I'm coming back to listen to this episode a few times because there was a lot of things in here that I need to rehear and rehash out and figure out how it's going to fit into what I'm doing and what I'm thinking currently. And it was just so helpful. I hope it was helpful for you as well. And next week we have Jonathan Foster, who has written some wonderful books. His most recent one is called Indigo, and we are talking about that one next week, so I hope you will enjoy that conversation. Until that one drops, maybe listen to this one just a couple more times. And all the links are in the show notes to connect with Dr. Timothy Carson and his work. So we'll see you next week. Peace out.